All right, we are almost at the top of the hour. We will give attendees uh, just a couple more minutes to join and we will get started. Oh, we are right at the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started with today's live webinar. And today we are talking about the top 3 frauds that affected finance and vendor teams last year and how to prevent them in 2022. Now, some housekeeping items before we get started. The session is being recorded and we will send you a link to the recording within 3 days. Most likely it will be tomorrow about this same time. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. We will save the Q&A. We will save them for the Q&A session during the last 10 to 15 minutes. And then lastly, don't forget to download the handouts. We do have a PDF of the presentation along with an authentication reference template that we will talk about, and then also a brochure from NS Knox. So I do want to introduce myself. I am the first speaker. I am Debra Richardson, and you may have heard of me by my saying, putting the AP in happy. I also have a podcast of the same name. Now, as a previous AP senior manager, I managed a team of 17 processing over 2,000 vendor requests per month. And to mitigate the fraud that we faced every day, we implemented authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices. I now work with vendor and finance teams to help them clean up their vendor data, clean up their vendor processes so that they pay the right vendor. And I am joined today by Natai Barzam, who is from NS Knox. And Natai, do you want to do an intro?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Nitai Barzam, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at NS Knox. We are a fintech security company, and we specialize in securing B2B payments against cyber-enabled fraud. And I'd love to talk to you about using technology and automation to prevent fraud and increase efficiency today.
All right, thanks, Natai. All right, so let's take a look at the agenda. So we're first going to look at the top 3 2020 frauds, and then we will review the 2020 fraud prevention tactics. First, looking at training your team controls and best practices to prevent fraud, giving you some takeaways that you can implement immediately. And then Natai will take over looking at how automation with the right tools can help you prevent fraud in 2022. And then we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. All right, so the top 3 2021 fraud trends. So this first one should not surprise anyone on the webinar today. According to the FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center, the average business email compromise scam where a fraudster attempts to trick finance and vendor teams into believing they are company leadership or their vendor to add or change the vendor's bank details is now $92,000 per incident. But we've all have heard of business email compromise incidents that are way more dollars, into the millions even. Now, One Treasure Island, a San Francisco nonprofit, found out the hard way. A fraudster hacked into their email system or the email system of the nonprofit's third-party bookkeeper, and then inserted themselves into the existing email chains by using similar email addresses to pretend to be people associated with the nonprofit. Now, the fraud spanned a month where multiple fake invoices were sent along with a request to change banking. Now, they lost $625,000 and they did not recover the funds. Now, what can be worse than using spoofed email? Well, not using spoofed emails. So fraudsters are in your finance and vendor teams and your vendor's actual email accounts because phishing attempts to gain login credentials have been so successful. According to a November 2021 report by Fish Labs, phishing in 2021 surpassed that of 2020 by 32%. And we thought 2020 was bad. But what does that mean? It means that the number of sites that these fraudulent emails try to get you to click on has increased. Again, so quarter three 2021 exceeded quarter three of 2020 by 60%. And social media, it is not helping. Oversharing increases the success or has been increasing the success of sending those phishing emails that really make it seem real. And how do they do that? It's because your personal data has value. So if you've ever answered those quizzes you're given, you have given fraudsters a piece of your data that they put together with other information that you share across multiple platforms, including gathering relationship data when you like a post. And they do that so that they can make that phishing email seem real and seem legitimate. They also take advantage of your team members when you go on vacation. We've all heard of the Shark Lady. She shared that she was gone on vacation and the fraudsters knew exactly when to strike. Luckily, her bank was able to recover the $400,000 that was initially lost. And then it's not just the external fraudsters. The third fraud trend for 2021 that we see is internal and occupational fraud. Now, according to Finances Online, 95% of companies have problems with internal or occupational fraud, with check and payment tampering being one of the most frequent ways that employees embezzle money. And so you might think, well, who are these employees? Well, based on this fraud triangle based on the fraud triangle from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, those employees have opportunity. They have access to systems and processes, right? Because they need certain access to perform their job. And many of them could have been given extra access to deal with the abrupt or continued move to working from home, and they may still have it. Right, and the second thing is that they feel pressure. The pandemic could have affected them. Maybe they lost income in the household as their partner stayed home to deal with stresses and requirements for virtual school, for example. And so they feel that financial pressure. And then the last one, the third thing, is just rationalization. So are they working harder than they used to? Are they covering for someone else that can't fully work from home? Or maybe there's another employee that left the company during this great resignation. So as we can see, 2021 either continued or increase the threat of fraud for finance and vendor teams. But before we start talking about some manual solutions you can put into place immediately, let me go ahead and launch our first poll. So let me get that up. All right, so the first question we'd like to ask is, how many suspicious communications did you receive in 2021? Was it more than 20? Was it between 10 and 20? Was it between 5 and 10? Was it between 1 to 4? Or did you not receive any suspicious communications in 2021? So that'll be interesting to see if anyone chooses E. But go ahead now and vote. I'll give about 10 to 15 more seconds for everybody to get their vote in, and then we'll take a look at the results. Yeah, it's coming in. All right, about 10 more seconds. Go ahead and vote if you have not already. We've got about over half that have come in. Let's see if we can get that a little bit higher. All right, so it looks like we have the majority have voted, so thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and close, and let's take a look at the results. All right, so the results of the poll show that the highest number of suspicious communications received in 2021 was between 5 and 10, with 10 to 20, or with 22% receiving 10 to 20, and then 19% more than 20. And then 17% 1 to 4. And we did have some that indicated that they received none. We had 3% that identified they haven't received any serious suspicious communications in 2021. All right, so thank you for that. Let's go ahead. I'm going to wrap that up and we will continue with the presentation. So we'll go to the next one. All right, so now that we've talked about the 2021 fraud trends, let's look at some immediate takeaways that you can implement to avoid fraudulent payments as a result of business email compromise, phishing and social media threats, as well as internal and occupational fraud. So first, we're going to look at how to prevent business email compromise, and this is really a two-step process. And the first step is when you receive a request to change banking, you need to authenticate the requester, whether they are a vendor or an employee submitting documents on behalf of the vendor. And you can do that by asking 2 to 3 identifying questions. And this process should sound familiar to you, as this is what banks, for example, put you through when you call in to make changes or get information on your account. And so you need to do the same thing for your vendors, and this can be done via phone or email. Now, for vendors, you can request confirmation of 2 to 3 validations that only the vendor or employees of the vendor would know, like an invoice number and the last 4 digits of the tax ID. Now, for bank change requests, I recommend to include the last 4 digits of the existing bank account number as one of the identifying questions that you ask. And if there is pushback because the requester does not know the last 4 digits of the existing banking, then you have to think that if they don't have access to the existing banking, how is it that they have access to the new banking in order to change it? And how do they have authority to even submit that new banking to you if they don't have access to the existing banking? Now, for internal employees, you may need to authenticate employees if your email system does not flag emails as external, or if employees email you or even call you outside of your work systems. You do want to request confirmation again of 2 to 3 validations that only the employee would know and that you or your team has access to confirm. So for example, you could use your next level up and their cubicle number. Now, this authentication matrix is one of the handouts that I've provided. So go ahead and download that and then customize that for your company. So the template that is attached is the authentication reference template that I've shown here, and you can go ahead and customize that as needed for your company. So that's step one. Step two is once they successfully authenticate, instead of accepting their banking details on company or bank letterhead, which can be forged, send them a company branded ACH form and require authentication of the form. So step two is you want to authenticate the data. Now, only send the form to those that authenticate, because you don't want a cyber criminal trying to gather information for this form to send it to you. Now, on the form, I do recommend that you require for bank changes either the existing banking details or the last three payments with deposit dates and amounts. I also recommend that you require the full tax ID. Now, optional, but I still recommend it, is to include the remit address and the vendor ID, since these two pieces of information can actually help your team to make sure that you're updating the right vendor record and the right address or payment location, depending on your accounting system or ERP. So requiring those pieces of data, if your vendor has them, especially with the vendor ID, to help your team as they update it in your accounting system or ERP. Now, best practices for this company branded ACH form is to make sure you change it every year. This way, it's a red flag if you receive an older version, because then you know that they were not just authenticated. Because if they were, then they would have been sent the most current version. Also, do not post it on any company website, again, because you only want to send it to those that you have authenticated. All right, so let's now look at how to prevent phishing by identifying phishing sites. So let's take a look at a tool to help you and your team identify a suspected phishing site. So fraudsters are getting smart. All those phishing emails designed to get you or your vendors or your employees login credentials, they are spoof domains, sometimes called typo squatting, and they can create these as they go, so they are very recent. I talked about the Shark Lady earlier, and what happened there is the fraudsters changed one letter in the email domain and no one noticed. Another example is they can do things like change an L to an uppercase I and then register the domain, or maybe even a double V in place of a W. So if you are suspicious, copy and paste, don't type it out, because you're going to type out what you see, that capital I and all. And fraudsters, right, love to impersonate brands, including Apple. But if you copy and paste apple.com directly from the email you received, you can see that it is in line with expectations, having a registration date of 2/19/1987. Now, if this was a spoof domain from a fraudster and they used a capital I instead of a lowercase l, then you would see a different registration date. And this is a very key tool, because the thing about finance, particularly with accounts payable, we really can't take heed to the don't click on any links or open any documents if you were not expecting them, because that is all that we get, right? Invoices from vendors we haven't heard of, and bank change requests from vendors that are among the thousands of active vendors in our vendor master file. So this is really a tool that you can use if there are red flags within the email to identify if the email is a suspicious email or a fraud attempt. Okay. And lastly, we're going to take a look at some controls that you can put into place to prevent internal or occupational fraud. Now, you want to use these preventative controls to combat internal occupational fraud, especially when there is a segregation of duties issue. And for accounts payable, no one team member should be able to create a vendor record, post an invoice, and then also generate a payment. So the first thing is a vendor master file review. So you can review all vendor ads, all changes made. So require that supporting documentation, for example, an IRS W-9 or that company branded ACH form, be attached to the vendor record so it can be reviewed either prior to the update in your accounting system or ERP or before the next pay cycle. Now, the next thing that you can do is review the backup for any non-PO invoices. That way you can verify the invoice and the vendor are valid. The next is the pay cycle review prior to releasing payments. So review reports of payments generated. I once had a client that would review invoices over a certain threshold that also had a recent bank change. And I think what they used was 300,000 and then any bank changes that were done within the last 90 days. And so they review that prior to any pay cycle or prior to releasing payments. You can also review invoices for existing vendors. You want to ensure that the invoice numbering is consistent with historical invoice numbers, and that way you can identify if any fraudulent or fake invoices have been submitted. And then lastly, you want to monitor vendor remit information, addresses, banking, to make sure that it does not match the banking in your employee file. So that continuous monitoring. Now, this can be done in the background and with a notification to management if there is ever a match. Now, you can also, right, with this continuous monitoring, continuously verify your vendor's information. And there are some third-party providers that can provide continuous monitoring. NS Knox will talk about how they can do this for your vendor's banking. So those were my immediate takeaways. And if you do not have them as part of your manual processes to collect and add or update your vendor's banking, please consider adding them to prevent fraudulent payments. And yes, they do add extra steps, which take more time and really depend on your employees in order to perform them. And so that's why NS Knox is here to show us an automated tool that can be put into place. And so I'm going to turn it over to NS Knox, but before I do, we've got one more poll. And let me go ahead and launch that. All right, and the poll is, do you currently validate bank account ownership? And the options are yes, US and non-US bank accounts, or yes, but US bank accounts only, no, or unsure. So let's go ahead and everyone go ahead and submit your responses. We'll probably give about 10 to 15 more seconds to get everyone in, make sure the majority of folks have responded. Yep, I see them coming in. So go ahead and keep responding. Probably about 10 more seconds. Looks like we have over half. Let's try to get most responding. If you haven't responded, few more seconds left to get your vote in or get your response in. All right, so it looks like they're slowing down and we've got the majority have responded. So I am going to go ahead and close this and let's take a look at the results. Oh, There we go, got it back. All right, so the results of the poll shows that 41% of those that have that are on the call today have do validate their bank account ownership, both U.S. and non-U.S. And then the next highest is 32% who do not validate bank account ownership. We have 15% that do validate bank account ownership, but for U.S. accounts, bank accounts only. And then the last 12% are unsure. All right, so thanks for responding. I'm going to go ahead and hide that. And now I am going to turn over the presentation to Natai. All right, Natai, you're on.
Thank you, Debra. And if you could make me presenter, I'll share my screen as well.
All right, and it should be coming right over to you. Okay, we can see your screen.
Are you seeing the big screen, the one with the presentation, or?
Yes, with the presentation, yes.
Okay, and if I do this, you're now seeing the Devo system, the live system?
Correct, we see my bank accounts.
Okay. All right, very good. Thank you so much.
Well, not my bank accounts, but.
Yeah, not mine either, but thank you, Debra. And thank you for sharing with us the top 3 fraud trends of last year's and some great controls and best practices to try and avoid these. And I'd like to follow up as you've promised and talk about how we could use technology and automation so that we could reduce the reliance on the human factor to avoid errors and prevent fraud while increasing efficiency. So first, let's have another look at these, top 3 fraud vectors and how they can impact your processes and systems. Now, different companies that I speak with may have slightly different processes, but at the end of the day, pretty much everybody have some sort of a process to onboard new payees, be it vendors, service providers, or anybody else that you may be paying. And then a process in place to get these new details or updated banking details in the system. Pretty much everybody has some sort of a system, an ERP system, a treasury management system, sometimes more than one, where they store this type data, which becomes data at rest. And finally, at some point in time, they process invoices, turn them into payment proposals, create payment transactions, and typically send payment files to banks or clearinghouses for processing. What's happening with the fraud vectors that we talked about? So first, we talked about BEC as the main trend, and BEC is obviously the proudest member of the social engineering group of attacks. It's very common, and as discussed by Debra, and as evidenced by the statistics provided by the FBI at the bottom, is very impactful. Over 166,000 incidents have been reported to the FBI, resulting in with $26 billion being lost. And the estimation is this is just 15% of the actual incidents because the others were not reported. Now, this is typically used for vendor impersonation, for executive impersonation, and alike. The bad news, though, is that social engineering today is not only limited to email, as we've talked before, but cyber criminals today are actually using technologies such as phone hijacking, phone spoofing, and deepfake AI-based voice cloning to impersonate over the phone. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about this incident, but it was recently made public where a bank manager actually received a call from a director of a company he was quite familiar with. The director actually claimed the company was about to make an acquisition and needed the bank to transfer $35 million. And the bank manager, having received the call from a phone number he was familiar with, have spoken to somebody that sounded exactly like the director, went ahead and processed this transaction, He actually was helped with some emails in his inbox from the director and the lawyer that was responsible for the deal. The bottom line is $35 million were lost. And I use this as an example to tell us all that yes, business email compromise and emails is still the biggest threat, but fraudsters have become, very, very good at tricking our unsuspecting employees into entering fraudulent banking details into the systems. So that's the first attack vector, trying to get the wrong details into our systems. Debra also mentioned insider fraud. This is the one, everybody hates the most. Nobody wants to think that, our employees from our finance departments or IT would steal our money. However, I have to say we must. Debra shared some statistics. You can also consider this report from PwC in their Global Economic Crime and Fraud Survey that have indicated that half of the economic crimes were actually committed by insiders or outsiders were helped by insiders. So this is pretty significant. Insiders, they know the best how to bypass our controls and how to cover their tracks. And so they can access data on the input. We may go through a lengthy process in trying to verify details, but if the wrong ones are entered, then we have a problem. They can also access data in our master vendor file after it's been stored, and sometimes they can also manipulate payment transaction files. I've recently had a discussion with a KPMG partner, and they shared in confidence without describing, the customer's details, obviously, but an incident in which IT professionals have actually accessed the underlying database under the ERP system to modify banking details. Payments went out to the wrong account, and then they changed the account back and erased the entries from the log file, which took a lot of time to identify. So internal fraud can actually manipulate details on the input, data at rest, and also on the output. We finally moved to talk about phishing and cyber attack. So first, we know phishing is constant. In fact, 97% of you have actually said you've experienced this. This actually becomes worse because if you consider a study by Cofense, they've indicated that 74% of the phishing attacks involve credential phishing, trying to get your username and password. And if we follow up with a statistic provided here by Tessin, then not only do they try to steal your credentials a lot, they also succeed in doing this. The study has actually shown that more than half of the organizations surveyed have admitted to having their credentials and accounts compromised. And some of you may have caught this up just yesterday. An article in Forbes discussed an operation against a Nigerian cybercrime gang. And in this operation and process, 800,000 compromised username and passwords were identified for 50,000 targets. So you should definitely consider that your credentials may be out there in the dark web. Now, if you add to this malicious software that's specifically designed to target your ERP systems, and you realize that fraudsters today have lots of tools to compromise banking data in your systems, and I don't know, maybe that's the reason why an IDC report reported that almost 2 out of 3 organizations surveyed by IDC admitted that their ERP system has been hacked. And when fraudsters are in your network, and we hear about these every day, they can manipulate your email system. When you hear about a ransomware case, this is where fraudsters have been in your system and they've encrypted your data. And in the case of payment fraud, they're in your systems and they may change the data in your ERP system or in your payment files, which you're sending to the bank. So taking all this into consideration, I think we must realize that fraudsters today are trying to manipulate banking details throughout the entire procure-to-pay journey. And given, this can happen to you, it could happen to any of your suppliers, any of your customers or business partners. We at NSNOX felt that a holistic and end-to-end payment security approach is required. And so that's what we've done. We developed Payment Knox, And Payment Knox is an end-to-end both incoming payment security and outgoing payment security. You may be, wondering for a second, what do we mean by incoming payment security? We feel, and many of our customers who've actually requested this from us feel that it's extremely important to make sure that when your customers or business partners make fund transfers to you, that they actually get to you and they're not defrauded. Not just because you want to make sure your customers are not defrauded and they're good, but you want to preserve your cash flow, and you don't want to be getting into discussions on whose fault it is that your customer was defrauded. So in order for us to support both incoming payment security and outgoing payment security, we've developed some cool pieces of technology. I'm not going to do a deep dive into the technological aspects of it, but let me quickly go over what these are, and then I'll try and demonstrate how they're put into good use. At the bottom, the first thing we've developed is a fraud-proof external security layer. This is based on patented technology. We've recently received a patent for it. We call this cooperative cybersecurity. In a nutshell, we do not store sensitive financial data as is. We shred it into meaningless pieces, and we store each of these pieces in a different location. This makes it much, much harder to expose, practically impossible to manipulate. And the reason for doing this is we want to make sure that even if your system is compromised, there's an external layer and there's no single point of failure. On top of that, we've built two important capabilities. One of them has to do with global account validation. This is the ability to confirm bank account ownership for any bank account anywhere in the world using strong identifiers like the entity ID, and not just the name, but also the name, the country at which they operate, their business address, and the fact that they're the positive owner of the bank account they claim to own. And lastly, a new technology that we call bank account certificate, which introduces a new way to share, verify, store, and protect banking data. Let's look at that one for a second. On the right-hand side, you see a picture of a bank account certificate. It looks like an innocent, PDF document, kind of like a bank letter that you may be receiving from your bank to confirm ownership of a bank account. It's got the name of the company, it's got its address, but you will notice that some of the details are actually masked out. The entity ID, their DUNS number, tax ID, and the bank account, not the entire bank account number, is provided. And the reason is not because we want to be hiding these details, but rather this is a very smart and secure document. And if you load this PDF document onto the Payment Knox software, it will do two things for you. First, it will decrypt the encrypted certificate that's buried within this document. But second, it will contact the secured backend that I mentioned before in order to verify that the details in this document are indeed correct. And what we've received with that is actually two layers of security. First, encryption and the fact that the document is signed. But more importantly, it is verified, because even if the details were manipulated in this document, manipulating the back end would be extremely hard. And with that, you could actually start sharing your banking details and ask anybody providing you their banking details to use a certificate. And this becomes much more secure. It can replace the manual processes that we discussed because now you don't need to verify the who it is that you're speaking with. The mere fact that they provide you with a document that's verifiable and confirms banking ownership per the details is enough. This protects both the paying and the receiving entities. You can create your own certificates and share them with anybody that's paying you. And you could ask for bank account certificate from anybody that you're sending money to, especially if you're transferring large amounts. Now, obviously, this is very useful to prevent payment fraud. And interestingly enough, it also helps you in the area of sanction screening. And the reason being is that when you search sanction lists using the name, You're not always sure if this is the real name of the bank account owner. Using this type certificate, not only do you know the bank account owner name for sure, you could also get the indication if they're in a sanctioned list or not. So these are the components. Let's see how they can be put to use to protect your payments. Let's start with protecting incoming transfers. It's pretty straightforward. The first thing you want to be doing, is even before you ask any of your vendors to do anything, is set an example, protect your own bank accounts, and protect your customers. Self-register, I'll show you in a second how you could do that. And then you can generate your own certificate. Once you receive the certificate, you can quickly share this with anybody that pays you. This could be done now over email. It could be done with your invoice and so on, because the document itself is encrypted and verifiable. Anybody that gets that can verify your banking details free of charge. They don't need to be users of our solution. They don't need to pay anything. They can do that anytime. And you also get the ability to track and confirm that they did verify your banking details. Let's look at how you might be doing this in a real system. Let's assume that you are Acme Inc. and you want to generate a bank account certificate. You're going to be filling a simple form with the details of your company, with a contact person, and most importantly, with the bank account details that you want to be registering. Now, once you're going to hit register down here, the engine behind the scenes is going to provide you with instructions to make a mini payment into an NSNOX validation account. This will trigger our technology, will trace the transaction back. It doesn't matter where in the world you're making this payment from. The system, if you will, gets a glimpse into the know your customer data that your bank has on your account, which is the most trusted source of information. We don't need you to send a void check. We don't need you to prove that it is you that we're talking with. We're not going to call you to verify the details. Merely by making this one-time transaction, technology-based solution confirms your ownership of the account. And now this means that not even, your finance people can register fraudulent accounts. Now, once verification is complete, it will show as an account in your system, and you could easily download a certificate file. And once you've downloaded one of these certificate files, it's going to look like this. The same thing as in the presentation, Acme in here. Share this with any of your customers. You may want to be doing this over email, which may look like this, and let them know in your invoice that in order to protect them, you're sharing the banking details with a certificate. Anybody receiving the certificate can go on a portal, and again, they don't need to be registered users. If they have your certificate, they'll choose I have my payee certificate. And now all they need to be doing is to drag and drop the certificate and hit verify. This gets decrypted, the backend gets contacted, and if everything is good, they get the green light. All the details are visible now. Acme's in the US, this is their address, this is their DUNS number, their tax ID is here. A special NOx ID is also provided to them, and they're the positive owner of the Bank of America account in the US with these details, both SWIFT and domestic. Obviously, if they receive details which are not correct, and they try to maybe search for Acme here, and they say, I want to search for Acme because I just received an email with an update, and let's say they just enter some details and try to verify this, the system's going to tell, no, this is not validated, and you better go out and contact somebody at Acme here to confirm what's going on. Now, once they've done this, you can always go into the recent verification log, and you will see here's an attempt that did not succeed, but here Natai and NSNOX have actually validated my account. If you're expecting a large payment, you could also create some alerts. For example, if one of your customers needs to be paying you something and you want to make sure that they receive the correct details, you can set an alert. If they did not verify the way I just showed you, then you will get an alert. That covers the part that talks about incoming payments. Let's now try to talk about outgoing payments. The first thing the solution can do is help you validate account ownership for any bank account of anyone of your vendors or service providers, anybody you're paying, and you want to be doing this globally, no matter where they are in the world, and you want to be doing this before you store it in your systems. The second thing you want to be doing is continuously protect your master data against internal and external manipulation. And you want to be doing this automatically. So you don't have to just randomly select an entry and see if it's valid. Yeah, you could actually create change logs, identify all the changes, all the additions, all the updates, and cross-reference this with your validation status to ensure that the data in your master data is still accurate every time. And lastly, you can verify your payment transactions before you approve them for payment and send them out. And again, you want to be doing this just to make sure that at the end gate, at the exit gate, before they leave the organization and are being processed by your bank, they're still only containing valid entries. And importantly, as well, is to let you know that you could use all these functionality either by using a secured portal. We call this the Payment Knox portal. You don't need to install anything. This is completely cloud-based. You just need to get set up in the system, and you could actually start using this tomorrow to validate account ownership, to protect your master data, and to verify payment files. That obviously provides you with the fastest way to start securing payments and include automation. We also provide Payment Knox Connect that helps you automate everything related to files. So you could automate the scanning of your master data. You could automate payment file upload and scanning and such. And we also offer a full set of APIs, which provides for integration with ERP systems, SAP, Oracle, others as well. Let me show you quickly how this may look in our solution. The first thing we typically do with customers is a process that we call baselining. This is where the first version of your master data gets uploaded in the solution. And once this is done, you could start, using this. If in your data you've got, a vendor that's got a bank account that was not verified, you have a choice of two things to do. The first thing you may want to be doing is you can initiate self-validation, i.e., you yourselves can mark an account as valid. In this case, you're not getting extra data, but you're actually documenting your own process with a system, an external system that is much, much harder to hack. So let's say you're doing phone verification. I know it's really hard to call those vendors in China and try to speak to them, but if you do this, then you can document this. And once you hit self-validate, the account becomes valid, but just for you, nobody else will know about that. However, if you're paying or about to pay somebody significant amounts, I would recommend, not to self-validate, but rather use the bank account certificate and the NSNOX standard validation. You could send anybody who does not have a bank account certificate yet into the validation portal for NSNOX. This is a multilingual site, so your vendors, regardless of where they are, can choose a different language. If they're in China, they can get instructions and frequently asked questions in Chinese, and Spanish, German, whichever. And once they get started, the system tells them, there's 1 or 2 steps you need to follow. You register and you follow instructions. Registration is kind of similar to what we've seen before. Let's say they're a customer in the US and they're called a new alpha record, they're going to fill in their details. Let's say they're a vendor in China. They may fill their details in China and they may use, the Chinese name or the English name of the company, their own tax ID number, and so on and so forth. The details for their bank in China, both the international ones or the domestic ones, and register. Now, based on the country at which they're based on the bank at which they are, the instructions that will follow will either tell them, like in China, if they're using a domestic bank account, no further actions required. India, no further actions required. If they're in the US and they're not in the system already, we're going to send something to them, a nominal amount, and ask them to send the amount back. In different countries, different processes, with the end result is to allow our technology to verify the banking details by doing the traceback that I talked about earlier. Now, once they've done this, you can go ahead and search for them. Or if they're providing you with a bank account certificate, then you could actually drag and drop that certificate into the solution, just like they could do this to yours, and validate the certificate. In the case of the provider from China, you could get their address, you could get their tax ID in China, and you can get the confirmation that their bank account was validated. This takes care of the input to the system. I'll spend a minute on showing you how you can, on an ongoing basis, monitor that the data in your system is still valid. At any point in time, you could either on demand or by automating this, verify your master data files. If I'm just gonna drag and drop a master vendor file into the system now actually compares the details in your current copy with the historical versions of it. And when it's incomplete, it's gonna generate the report that tells you new bank accounts added, details updated, details removed. And most importantly, it will cross-reference this with the validation status. So in the case of Foroli, it will tell you, hey, this vendor did generate a bank account certificate and they were standard validated, and here are all the details. Or in the case of Viva la Repubblica, you have a new bank account, it's in France, here's the IBAN, however, it's not validated. And the nice thing about this is that it shows you this, ahead of time, before you even get to payment. So auditing your master data and ensuring its integrity and security on an ongoing basis is really important. And the last thing I'll show you today is really quick how you could also run payment transaction checks. If you take a payment file, and we support a lot of different file formats, if yours is for some reason not supported, then we introduce it to the system. You can simply drag and drop it or automate this using Payment Knox Connect. So everything is done automatically. Your payment file gets scanned and you may get alerts. Now, you can see two of them here. In here, the payment's rejected because the account is not in your master vendor file. And as a rule of thumb, you should never be paying accounts that are not in your master data. So that's definitely something to be looked at. And the second one is also interesting because it shows that the level of verification for the bank account that's in your master data is not sufficient for the amount being paid. You could actually set thresholds and say, you know what, up to $1,000, I'll take a risk. Between $1,000 and $10,000, self-validation is okay, but above that, I want to make sure that they're standard validated, and the system will actually flag these for you. And with that, Debra, I'll hand it back to you for any comments and questions and answers.
All right, thanks, Natai, for that great demonstration. Automation tool for making sure you do not pay a fraudulent vendor or a fraudulent payment or make a fraudulent payment to a fraudster. So let me go ahead and take back, and I will show my screen, and hopefully you will see the right one. Yep, it's up. Okay, so before we get into Q&A, and we do have one question in here already, and I'll remind everyone, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the Q&A section. Before we get to that, though, I do want to launch the last poll question, so let me go ahead and get that queued up. All right, so you should see it now on your screen. And so this poll question is, how do you protect your payments? Either we do not have special processes or tools, or we rely on manual processes or employee training, or we use technology-based solutions. So go ahead and select the response that applies to you. We'll probably give this about 10-15 more seconds. Make sure we get most folks responding. Yep, we've got them coming in. All right. About 10 more seconds, so go ahead and vote if you haven't already. Okay. Looks like we have the majority of folks voting. I'll give about 5 more seconds and then we'll close that up and take a look at the results. All right, it looks like we have, yep, so last ones are coming in. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and close that off and then let's see what the responses were. So the responses to the poll, so the highest amount, 48%, we rely on manual processes and or employee training. And then 45% say that we use technology-based solutions. So about half and half, we have 6% that say they don't have any special processes or tools. All right, so let's go ahead. Thank you for that. I'm going to close that out. All right, so I did want to insert in here, and we'll get through this really quickly, just how you can connect with me. I do have my social media here, along with, I mentioned my podcast, and there's a link to that. I also have a YouTube channel with Vendor Master File Tip of the Week every Tuesday, so make sure you subscribe if you're interested. And then now we're going to get to questions and answers. We've got about 5 minutes and we do have one in. And this really says, it might be more of a comment, but Natai, I'm sure we can both respond to it. So the question is that the mailbox of the vendor was hacked and we received a message for change of the bank details. So I assume theoretically, hacker had an info about an old bank account. In that case, the only way was to call a contact person of the vendor. And so I see where you're coming from. What I will respond to that to say is, if you have, the more layers that you can have, if you do not have a tool in place to validate bank account ownership, the more layers that you can have where you can kind of eke out that fraud, the better. So if you authenticate the requester and the fraudster is not able to answer your 2 to 3 questions, then that eliminates them from that step. If for some reason they do get through that step, then you're going to be asking for the full bank account information and or the last 3 payments, the last 3 payment dates and amounts. And that can eliminate fraudsters from getting through to changing those bank details via your company branded ACH form. And the other thing I'll respond to that to say is, that confirmation phone call, I once had a manager contact me of an accounts payable team to say that her team was making a lot of confirmation phone calls because they were getting fraudsters calling in to pretending to be vendors, asking what the payment status was. And when they found an invoice that was ready to be paid for a significant amount of money, they would then submit a bank change. Now, they didn't make the change because her team was making that phone call, but just think of how many phone calls or confirmation phone calls they could have avoided by authenticating the requester and authenticating the data. The other thing I'll say on that is that it's not that easy to make that confirmation phone call. Yes, it can be done. Best practice, if you do it, you use information from your vendor master file, and also you try to find a different contact on your vendor master on your vendor master file to confirm with and who submitted the request. But it's kind of hard because the vendors don't always, they submit you your vendor their change request, bank change request, and then they're off doing vendor things. They don't always, pick up on the first or even the second or third try. So you have to make sure that you're documenting when you're making those phone calls, that you're documenting the attempts so that you don't lose the fact that you have that request to process. But all of that could be avoided, right, Natai, with the right automation tools.
Absolutely. 100%. If you don't, use this best practice process today, then definitely use that. However, all in all, if you use, automation and technology like a bank account certificate and the standard validation that I talked about, then you can just, avoid these phone calls altogether. I have customers that, they may be in the West Coast and employees have to call the vendor in India or in China from home. And even when they do get hold of them, they're not willing to speak, and sometimes, language barriers and such. So
Good point.
definitely technology is nice.
All right. Okay, so we are at the top of the hour. I do want to remind everyone that if you do have any questions that you want to post after the webinar, feel free to send emails to the email addresses on the screen, and you'll also receive those in the follow-up email with the link to the recording within 3 days. So I want to thank everyone for attending, and I want to wish you to have a great rest of your day. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Natai.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.